Our next session really speaks to our theme of resilience thinking. I would like to introduce Trish Kerin from IChemE Safety Centre, Rob Berton from Qenos, and David Schelbach from Ixom, who form this exciting industry panel. Welcome to the forum, Trish, Rob and David. Now, Trish has represented the industry on many government committees related to process safety and sits on the board of NOPSEMA and the Mary K. O'Connor Process Safety Centre Steering Committee. Trish is a chartered engineer, registered professional process safety engineer, fellow of IChemE and fellow of Engineers Australia, and is the director of IChemE Safety Centre. Trish has also spent several years working in project management as well as operational and safety roles for the oil, gas and chemical industries. Now, Rob Berton, he is the Safety, Health and Environment Manager at Qenos and has over 40 years experience working in complex major hazard facility operations. David Schelbach is the Chief Officer, Safety, Health and Environment at Ixom, operating in over 10 countries worldwide. So in this panel discussion, we'll hear from industry on how they have responded and managed the COVID-19 risks whilst continuing to manage process safety during times of uncertainty. At the end of the session, Trish will facilitate any questions you have for our panel. So if you have a question for the panel, post it at any time in the Q&A box. I'll now hand over to Trish, who is going to facilitate this discussion.
Thanks a lot for that introduction, Yvette, and welcome to my fellow panellists. I think it's certainly known everywhere that the world has gone through some quite substantial upheaval over the past 12 to 18 months. And how we do business over that time has changed substantially. That has led to a lot of evaluation on the way we handle certain risks, the way we deal with risk assessment, the way we deal with our day-to-day operations. How do we continue supply? How do we maintain keeping our workers safe so far as is reasonably practicable in this uncertain environment that we're currently living in? So in this panel session, we're going to hear from both Rob and David around how they have coped in their organisations and some of the challenges they've seen, so that perhaps we can all learn how to create some more resilience in our own organisations as we go forward. So Rob and David, welcome and thank you for joining us today. So we'll have the opportunity for questions from the audience throughout this panel session as well. So please put your questions into the questions panel and I'll get to them as we work through. If I could just get David and Rob to both make sure they're off mute. So Rob, let me ask you the first question. What was your experience from working with the different regulators during the COVID response? Because obviously there was Department of Health as well as WorkSafe. What was your experience there?
Yeah, thanks, Trish. In fact, I want to start by saying how exceptional really the crisis leadership was demonstrated by federal, state, governments, regulators, community and industry. I think we should be very proud as Australians of what we achieved there. So, and you know, any sense of concern going forward in my discussion has to put in the context of extremely difficult circumstances to manage and a lot of uncertainty. So I just want to make that point. The stress on our health regulators in particular was particularly high and persistent. And if we were in their shoes, I'm sure trying to get everything right and for one specific industry would be very difficult. So I'm very appreciative of that. At the beginning, what was very useful was Federal Health and Safe Work Australia, maybe working with the other regulators, but somehow they got a lot of good information to us, the industry, in an extremely quick time, and so useful to have an authoritative common source of information so we can manage the fear and uncertainty with our workforce and for our business continuity. Unable to explain how grateful that having that information was for us and how important it was. The other thing it highlighted how great it was to have one common source of information. A federal source for state for businesses that work across the state. It was brilliant for the first couple of months to have one source to look at and do that. We always talk about national approaches. That was an example of a perfect example of it. In general, the regulators, I mean the state health and WorkSafe, safe work type regulators, it was a very positive experience overall. At the same time, there were some significant frustrations, and I'll go through that in a second. I think the frustration came from, I in particular and Qenos, we're looking for answers to questions that they probably didn't have at the time. So the frustration came out of, we had to learn how to manage our business, a bit like the Wild West, learn to do current risk assessment without a lot of information necessarily. So that was part of the frustration, not necessarily an issue of regulators. And I guess the other thing is at some point in time, I think a few months in, the health directions and guidance started to come from the state health authorities, and also then with support from the OHS and the MHF regulators. There were differences in the directives between the states a little bit, mainly it was common, but those small differences just added to the complexity of what we had to do, because we needed people to look at parallel rules and regulations. But in the end, that was a small thing. But I think, again, it's frustrating to have to deal with the fact that it's not a common advice to industry for a common hazard. And I think everyone had to recognise the health regulators under the emergency powers were the decision makers, not the MHF regulators or anyone else. So, and they had to revert to practical prescriptive directives, no doubt due to practical necessity, because they couldn't do it any other way. But this led to us having little flexibility around applying our normal risk-based approaches to managing holistic risk. So we're very used to, as a MHF, no doubt, to manage risk with all the advice and guidance provided by our own knowledge and also any regulations. And we sort of lost that in the COVID, because the ability to risk manage the COVID health within a process safety environment became conflicted at times in certain areas. However, most of the directives were very manageable. They were tough, but manageable. We in Qenos, at least, and I think a few other the industry, had one particular ruling that was particularly problematic and is still not resolved today, I believe, is a definition of close contact in a closed space for greater than 2 hours, which meant that anyone in an operating control room, our shift teams, were basically could be captured into a quarantine, 14-day quarantine situation, and worst case, maybe even 2 shift teams. So then we get into that panic around how we manage that event. It's the equivalent of taking 2 pilots out of a jumbo jet at 30,000 feet before they land safely. And most of our businesses also, when you land safely, there's a whole bunch of inventory and risk management to do just by monitoring. So leaving it unmanned is a very scary thing to do. And then you've got the workforce issues to deal with. Once they get instructions from government, they'll be told to do something, and we've got to manage the risk, and we have that conflict as well. So that was a real conflict, and that's what kept us, quite concerned and up at night trying to figure out, if that potential happened, how would we manage it? And of course, the issue of a full bubble of all our workforce with family in some sort of hotel system was just not practical for us in an industrial reality. So we're still always worried about how the health regulators would actually manage that actual event in real time. And of course, in this real time, it happens in real time. You've got hours to decide what to do, etc., and you have to get advice from the regulator at short notice. So, and we think the health regulators, whilst very educated and stuff, were not necessarily familiar with or appreciating our MHF operational risk to the point where they understood the timelines that we're working under. And maybe David will go through some of that in terms of, he had a real event. Qenos was mainly just a potential.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. So because of that big significant change between prescriptive and performance-based regulation, which you were more used to, how did you really go about incorporating process safety into the health discussions with the health department to understand those differences?
Yeah, quite an important thing. Of course, in Victoria, we had a couple of first wave, which was smallish, and then we had the large one. So just in that context, but through that whole thing, I think our previous and current excellent working relationship with Vic MHF regulators, particularly Simon and his team, we were in touch and sharing these concerns through the period, and had a lot of support from Simon and his team to do that. When the second wave came, I think Victoria and Melbourne in particular felt the brunt of, this is now real, this could actually occur. That got us into the issue of requesting support from Simon and his team. And I think within the day we had direct lines of communication to the Department of Health, which we could not get on our own. So we got connected with some expert Department of Health people, such as Dr. Bruce Hocking, who's an OP. And within days, we had site visits, him understanding what we're dealing with in the control rooms, advice back to us on what we could do to minimise, to help them do their risk assessment at the time, if it did occur, to minimise the impact of losing the whole shift team, down to air conditioning advice, etc. So I think what happened there, we ended up then also based on some sharing between MHF forums with other industry. It all encouraged us to activate our drills, COVID drills, and we did some drills. Live cleaning with a shift team involved, operational environment, actual deep cleaning, shift handover type impacts. We shared all the risk information with we had the Department of Health when MHF regulator involved in that drill by WebEx. And we also helped develop our contact protocol, so we had more assurance around if a real one occurred, how we would go about doing the risk assessments with the Department of Health. And I think that gave us a greater sense of confidence to manage this event and made us more resilient. Even so, the perfect world of us running our own risk management and being able to do it independently was not there, and still is not, because the directives come from the Department of Health in a sense. So that's what we did. We sort of we called for help, and it came in spades from MHF Victoria, and through the Department of Health, they were very collaborative.
Okay, thanks for that. So, David, from a practical perspective, you had the challenge of a potential positive case detection occur within one of your workplaces, when the health protocols were requiring shutting down and deep cleaning, all those sorts of things. As we've just heard from Rob, that is potentially an unsafe situation to be in with the chemicals we handle. How did you go about dealing with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Trish. And yes, I think like our story was probably one that was taken across industry. And so I think, and the timeline is very similar to as Rob was just sharing as they were beginning their interactions with the Department of Health. It was early June. It was a Saturday. It was lunchtime on a Saturday, and I took a phone call that one of our shift employees had just been diagnosed with COVID-19, and that immediately we needed to respond to that. I think, starting at the top, and then I'll probably give a little bit more context. We had our protocol plans in place in that we knew that we would call the Department of Health on a particular 1-800 number, and we had our cleaning companies lined up, and we knew that we would call them and get them in. Like, the first thing that we learned is that 1-800 number that we were all told to call on the website doesn't really actually go anywhere. Or not to someone that can help you as a major hazard facility on a Saturday afternoon. I think Monday to Friday we might have had a bit more luck, but on a weekend it was really tough. And I went down multiple, press 1 here, press 2 there, press 3, tried all the options, and eventually got some central advice. And probably to cut to the chase, that although our employee had tested positive and got their result on a Saturday, they had been tested on the Thursday. They were due to resume shift on a Friday. Because of our protocols, if you are awaiting a test result, you were not to come back to the workplace. So that had been enacted. They were being tested as a precaution at the time because their spouse was in the healthcare sector, and because they were being tested to return to work in a healthcare role, our employee was being tested as a precaution. That was just what was happening at that time with health directives. Thankfully, our employee, completely asymptomatic and luckily holistically remained asymptomatic and suffered no ill health through his time with diagnosed COVID. The last time his shift had finished the previous Monday morning. So applying the rules at the time, you went back 48 hours from the time of testing, which actually got us to Tuesday. So that was what I was able to communicate to the Department of Health initially through the screening process, that what do we need to do? We've got an employee tested positive. They haven't been in the workplace during this time period. And the initial advice was, okay, you're out of the woods. It's okay. You do need to notify WorkSafe because it was within the 14-day period because that regulation was in force, which we did. However, we didn't need to do anything else. In parallel to that, we'd actually found a contact direct to, I guess, the live nerve centre control room with the Department of Health, and been able to make contact. And one of the doctors on staff dealing with providing advice to industry gave me a call, took the situation, supported the central advice I'd been given that we didn't need to do anything. Around 9:45 Saturday night, I took a phone call. We've redone our risk assessment, and we would like you to ensure a deep clean takes place. We would actually like you to. We had precautionarily taken our people out and said that we're on shift with the person that had tested positive. Said, please do not come to work until you get a negative COVID test. But we were then asked to have the entire site, anyone that had been on site for the previous 2 weeks for greater than 15 minutes, to be tested for COVID. And it's not that we're actually looking to see whether our employee had passed it on to those people, but this was at a time of great discovery for Victoria when we were having hundreds of cases a day. How did our employee get it? So they're actually looking to see, was there anyone in the workplace that had passed it on? So we had to have 60 employees on site tested, along with tracking down roughly 200 contractors, be contract truck drivers that had passed through the site as well. So that was a massive undertaking. And the Department of Health was fantastic in working with us. They wrote us letters. They gave us special dispensation for the nature of the search that they were trying to doing. That although we were all told you must isolate until you get your negative result, for these almost secondary potential contacts or sources, people were given a letter such that they were able to return straight to work while they were waiting for their result, which that was, I guess, a risk-based approach by the central department group, but not well communicated to the testing centres. And our people were, and our contractors were being told, no, you must go home and isolate. One situation was as much as the letter was taken, scribbled out, and said, no, go home and isolate, which created a lot of tension for us as an employer to then try and settle these people down. Because I think for those of us that were in Victoria and lived through this, it was a time of great, I guess, fear is a strong word, but we were trying to get compliance with the rules because we were in lockdown and we were trying to move through and get control of this situation. So those were some of the challenges we faced. The other one, and which Rob did talk about, cleaning drills, was we had assigned a contractor. We knew we would call this contractor. The contractor arrived on site and one said, what would you like us to clean? And we actually probably hadn't really thought through how far do you clean a chemical plant? And do you clean the front office as well as the control room because the exposure had occurred? Do you clean the workshop? So initially started with the control room and the workshop. And then they're like, okay, if you guys could just leave the control room for 2 hours, please, while we complete this clean. And we're like, no, we're running a major hazard facility here. We're not able to depart the control room. And so we had to work through that, which then, as Rob's mentioned, I think us sharing our story gave other MHFs and other DG sites the opportunity to prepare for this situation. That the standard default answer would be evacuate your site for hours or days while the deep clean takes place. And that's just not possible when you have to have a core crew running a major hazard facility. So I think those are probably some of the key elements of our lessons learned. And some key, if you haven't thought through that even today, I know Australia is in a much better place, but if you haven't thought of these sort of idiosyncrasies of your operations, I'd strongly suggest that you get to the next level of detail of your planning of how to keep your plant running and try and establish those links with the Department of Health so that you know who to call when you get that call on a Saturday night or a Sunday morning.
Okay, thanks for that, David. So obviously, it sounds like what was happening with the different directives, potential cases, all these sorts of issues. It was a really chaotic time within a major hazard facility in trying to deal with these issues. But as with all chaotic times, sometimes there are some real positives that come out as well as the challenges. So, Rob, what were some of the positives that you saw out of this event that we all lived through?
Yep. And just a little bit back for Qenos, we were lucky to have an existing pandemic plan based on SARS. So we had at least a framework, although when I look back now, it's a little mini baby compared to what we've got now. But it was a place to start. We also had China contacts which shared their processes, given that we're a China China-owned business. So they gave us early. We took the early warning seriously because of maybe all that, but also because of the nature of what we are. And we prepared the organisation to act seriously early on, almost end December, early January, we were preparing ourselves for it. So we're getting our exec ready. The executive quickly got to review the pandemic plan in advance, preparing them to set up the COVID response team. So the early planning part was a positive for us in that if you haven't got that in your system and your thing, it's one of these pandemic things you go, well, this will never happen. Just it doesn't happen, but it does, as we know. So that was positive. And the other thing, or the philosophy, was we stay ahead of government directives. In other words, the government could be a bit slow in doing some things. We could be quicker as an industry. So we stopped international travel almost immediately to China. We didn't wait for the government announcement. That was like 2 weeks ahead. So by having the 2 weeks ahead of government precautionary thinking where we could and sensibly, it provided us a little bit more sense of control rather than reacting to a government directive. We were sort of almost doing that before the directive came out, and in most cases that provided our workforce and ourselves a sense of comfort and removed the fear a bit more, if you like. So that was positive. The workforce collaboration, we have a pretty tough environment, industrial environment sometimes, when it comes to doing things. But I tell you what, the workforce, collaborated excellently. They got behind all the stuff we had to do. We had to communicate things, and we told them we might be asking you to do things without the chance to consult. In other words, we're just going to have to do this, and then you can consult in parallel if we have to, but hang with us while we say we're going to do things quickly. And by being upfront at the very beginning, that worked very well. Where we could consult, we did, but where we'd have no time, particularly with shift environments, you can't get across everyone. We just made decisions and then hopefully correct as we go. So that collaboration was excellent. And once connected with the Department of Health, including both New South Wales, Victoria, the collaboration there was excellent as well. I guess through the process, we've developed very detailed COVID response plans now as a resource now for any next pandemic, God forbid. But we have upped our scale of knowledge there. I think if you look at the Asian countries, they had already had this in, SARS already gave them the advantage of having a lot of detailed procedures and practices and training with their people. And I think now we've got a lot of that documented. If we have to do the training next time, there's an inbuilt skill and awareness. So I think we've honed our skills, if you like, to a hazard that we've not really taken seriously in the past. So I think that's made us more resilient going forward for any type of health issue external like that. So really, and then we took the precautionary approach, as I said, to try and maximise our care for on-site essential workers, and particularly making them feel comfortable to be here and supported. And we went out of our way to do that. And at the same time, you get the benefit of it boosts our business continuity to be ready for it.
All right, thanks, Rob. David, what about from your perspective? What were some of the positives that you got out of it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what Rob's talked about was a similar experience for us. Again, I think we did have a base pandemic plan similar. We have the majority shareholder of Ixom is based out of Singapore, so they were able to provide us probably their experience from pandemic management, again closer to the SARS and bird flu outbreaks that have been more influential probably a decade ago. I think something that was key to us was that, particularly for our major continuous plans, was establishing our workforce bubbles. And something I didn't really allude to, I didn't probably close out when I spoke previously, was around creating the workforce bubbles was part of probably the psychological safety in the workplace. And and supporting mental health. I mean, like you come back to those of us here in Victoria and to another one of our sites in New South Wales as well. This sort of it was the fear of what could happen. We were in the peak of this in sort of the June, July. A lot was we still didn't really we didn't understand COVID like we understand it now, and so really we really shut down shop on our teams, and we had to then leverage technology to create the morning toolbox meetings. That I think for those of us that work in MHFs and big continuous plants, the morning meeting is a strong ritual that occurs everywhere, and it's a key ritual that allows information transfer between the shifts, between management, between maintenance, between operations. And so you've got to find continuity of that morning meeting to get that. And so I guess we've been lucky that we've been investing in Microsoft products in the Office 365 suite for a number of years, and I think in late 2019, early 2020, we were just starting to turn on Microsoft Teams. I think for those of us all of us were probably using tools like Teams or WebEx and that, we all had our cameras turned off because no one still wanted to turn their camera on. But it drove us to now turning our cameras on, and I think we're all very comfortable now, like we are right now, sitting with our camera on and speaking. And 18 months ago, that was not the case. So it forced us for adoption of technology. So that was the day-to-day of how we kept the connectedness between the work groups, although trying to keep the physical separation to manage the health and ultimately the psychological safety of people and how they were feeling about the anxiousness of potentially contracting the virus. Similar theme, and something that we, again, as long-term safety professionals and those of us in hazardous industry, an audit is something that always occurs on site. And I think us as Ixom, we said, okay, we will pause our audits for 6 months while we look to see how this shakes out. And we did our management of change, and what risk controls do we have in place to delay any audit program that we have. Like as Ixom, we operate 10 major hazard facilities across Australia and New Zealand. It's written into our safety cases that we are auditing our sites at least once every 3 years. So we've got this governance that does need to happen. We use an independent major hazard expert auditor consultant that comes in, and she started to, with her other clients, began trialing remote auditing, and so using technology. And so at the 6 month mark, we said, okay, this, although we still had the tail end of lockdown, we weren't out of it here in Victoria, and our auditor was Victorian based, so we couldn't get her anywhere else either, because no one wanted anyone from Victoria in their states either. So we said, but we've got to keep this governance process going. And so we started trialing remote auditing, and it's actually been very effective. And subsequently, we've probably adopted a hybrid blend of, because we always tended to work with our external auditor plus an independent support member from my team. And we now sort of tag off such that we will have one person going in while the other person is remote auditing, because we have actually found the deep dive, particularly on the system side, has actually worked very well in being able to produce the right evidence. And because of Teams or WebEx or Zoom, whatever, the ability to screen share and get into systems and ask those questions is good. When we talk to our independent auditor, she's like, you do miss the eyeballing of people, but with the camera, you do get a lot of that. And by sending that secondary auditor in that's still able to get the feel and of the site for things that may not come through from the audit, we've actually found it's been quite successful. So moving forward, we'll probably continue with a blended model because we aren't finding too many drawbacks to it.
Okay. So just picking up on that technology aspect, and this goes back to your site cleaning challenge. Questions come in from a few people around, so were you not actually able to set up a temporary control centre to be able to evacuate the main control centre for those couple of hours of cleaning?
In the time period we had and the nature of our operations, the short answer is no. The way our I guess our control room is built is there is some hardwired instrumentation that you want to have access to. Mm-hmm. But I guess from our perspective, we just hadn't contemplated, like we had a view on what a clean would look like, and it didn't involve, and even to the point, and I think Rob and I had this conversation around it. If we need to put our guys in SCBA for them to fog the room, we would have done that, and that was our view as to how we would manage it. We would put people in a full SCBA unit, and yeah, it just wasn't feasible for us with that particular operation to set up. But I think for those in hindsight, and I think I've seen a bit of feed there as well, hindsight lessons learned, if you can have alternative control room setups, I think that is a very good idea for your asset, absolutely.
Okay, thanks for that. So when we were preparing for this panel, we actually had a conversation around the idea of, what we call the Longford risk. So, the idea of how we provide remote support to a facility when we don't have the people that we potentially are used to having on site. And I guess there's also been a question come in around how did this crisis affect your emergency planning and response capability? So I'd like to join those two questions together, if I may. So how did you deal with the idea of emergency response whilst you also had potentially lower levels of resourcing available to you on site? Rob, do you want to go first?
Well, our shift teams are essential workers. Our emergency response really didn't change. Obviously, the people who are doing that are the shift guys, and they were working on site. If we did any change, it would have done under a management of change, but we had no need to. Right. In terms of support to them, the CMT or the crisis management team is more of a out of immediate emergency response, but we still had that set up as either through the leadership team, through WebEx, or the ability to come on site as an essential worker. So all our essential people had essential worker permits set up. And certainly the emergency response, we didn't see it being impacted, because the engineers and other type of people not here aren't typically the ones, it's got to work 24/7. If it's working at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, it'll work anytime. So that's the theory.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what Rob said. Like we have minimum manning or minimum staffing levels, and it is driven by our emergency response capability. And with our people being deemed essential workers, we never dropped below those staffing levels. And so, yeah, thankfully, in that respect, our emergency response was not impacted. And I mean, as COVID was starting to ramp up, even before the first lockdown in Melbourne, I worked with our Australian head of manufacturing. I said, "This is what's coming. You need to figure out how you're going to run, how far you can go, and what's your scenario planning going to be to keep these, particularly our key major assets running, because the chemicals we supply go into drinking water for this country. So it's not an option for us to, yes, we hold security stock for a number of months, but it's not an option to be out for an extended period of time because we don't have staff to run. So we did take proactive steps to build, in our 4-shift roster sites, a 5th shift that could be swung in. We took ways to pull apart the shifts to create extra shifts. We took the time in the early days to ensure that we had staff, engineering staff trained up, capable as at least maybe not panel operators, but outside operators, and the ability to that. So building up that resilience so that we could build, and ultimately with our 2 core sites providing the core drinking water chemicals for the country, basically built a completely resilient backup. So if we were to lose all 16 to 20 operators, we had found ways to move that around at that point in time to allow that we could still keep the plant running if we needed to, and meet all of our safety case requirements around minimum staffing and emergency response. Okay. But it was a lot of juggling and a lot of good thinking that went into that, and a lot of collaboration between the work groups.
Yeah. In terms of some of the more technical support stuff, so as Rob said, and yourself, David, they're not on site 24 hours a day, but they are on site typically. Did you have instances where you did have reduced resources of your technical support staff, and even just the idea of running into someone in the corridor and saying, oh, by the way, this happened, or just those very brief interactions that are so valuable in a face-to-face environment that we completely lost them in this virtual world effectively? How did you cope with those, David?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Trish, and as I sit here in a head office with the global head of manufacturing 2 doors down, it was probably one of our key challenges that we discussed a lot. And it was a real balance. Like we sites, like I said, it's the Longford scenario, sites need their technical support there. And so we did set up we basically divided the work group in half. And so you probably had 50% technical support staff on site at any one time, because in our view, these are essential workers. Like the technical support staff in times of in the high hazard engineering environments, you need that support staff there. And then I think all work groups again got used to what probably became Teams overload, but the ability to use a video conferencing camera on and have those conversations. And if it was an acute issue, we would get the technical support staff out to the site. But I do think we probably did lose some of those key hallway conversations during that time for sure.
Yeah. Okay, Rob.
Similar, Trish. Certainly, essential worker role had that as part of the justification for, we had engineers working from home and from office, so we had that almost like a rotation, so people got to come in and out. So, but the essential badge was put on that issue and explained to our engineers that, the reason they're here is because of that type of requirement. Yeah, you do have to explain that to some, but it's that Longford learning was something that has been stuck in our culture.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Chris. Trish, I would just add. And again, it goes back to people's mental health as well on both sides. So one is providing the technical support, but you can't underplay the fear that people had of other people being in their workspace and having to come into the workspace. And our operating teams took their role to continue to provide our products to our customers very, very seriously because of the flow-on effect of public health from, like I said, continue around drinking water, wastewater treatment. And so they took it very seriously to maintain their health, and they really did want to keep their bubble in the control room. So even with that technical staff on site, the technical staff still weren't going to the control room unless it was a real key situation. So yeah, just don't underplay, I guess, how people felt from a mental health perspective as well.
Okay. Can you both share what type of risk assessments you were doing for the COVID risk and indeed other risks and how those controls were then reviewed? Was it more of a focus in the OHS space, or did you bring the process safety tools and ability into doing those assessments? How did you go about those? David?
I think probably because we are a process safety sort of and critical risk focused organisation, to attack COVID holistically as an organisation, we did a bow tie risk assessment. So that's where we started, and we looked at all the different threat pathways of someone contracting COVID in the organisation, and then what controls do we have, and then with that threat control framework, we took that back to our operating sites, and that's what like we had COVID safe plans before there were COVID safe plans. Because it was based on our threat control frameworks this is our playbook as to how, here's the threat, here's the risk, here's the controls, and then we went to, for those that you were calling out as critical controls, treating them like any other critical control, validating the effectiveness of that control, and ensuring that it was in place. So I guess just like a few years ago when mental health in the workplace became a bigger issue, with an analytical lens, how do you tackle it? We do a bow tie risk assessment on mental health as well, and the framework works. And so we tackled COVID the exact same way.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
I wouldn't say we went to the bow tie method. It was probably more procedural and OHS and building those sort of reviews into our normal system. So whatever normal things our people had to do, we built in a control through that, be it the JCAs or our safe work review templates. So basically wherever our workers would normally have to look at a risk, we started building in COVID there. So it's not a new thing for them. It's use the same tools and just consider it as another hazard. Okay. So that we tended to build it into our existing systems as much as we could.
Okay. Did either of you have any issues regarding international ship transfers coming into your facilities at all?
Pass.
No? All right, no worries.
No, I can say during the peak, no. But I can say, like, we, if it hasn't happened in the last week or two, it's come out very. We've got a ship to shore load of sulfuric acid coming in for our business, and so the COVID protocols are actually quite mature now, in such that actually our staff have been fast tracked to have the opportunity to be vaccinated prior to the ship to shore transfer occurring. Now, this, like I said, it's either occurring in the next week or two, or has just occurred in the last week or so. But also a lot of protocols around having expectations from I think ports and the appropriate regulatory bodies overseen by the Department of Health, but a number of COVID tests in the lead up. So I think at 10 days out, then our people will be tested at probably day 2 and day 11, I think, after the ship to shore transfer is completed as well. So it seems to be that the Department of Health, in conjunction with, I guess, Border Force, is brokering some key controls in that space to manage the COVID risk.
Okay. Do either of you have any recommendations for how we might handle an event like this in the future? Sadly.
Yeah, I'll start with this one. I think the chaos of the beginning and the concern, David mentioned the fear, it was real. The second wave made it really real, and it really affects people. And I guess the regulators are in the same boat. So in terms of, they get caught short with this stuff as well as industry. But managing from an MHF point of view, how to get into the decision makers' view when we're a small component of the big community problem, and get attention on a process safety sort of event, is how in the future we would avoid, having that coordinated through the right regulators who understand the industry and how they are connected into the health department decision making, and whether the government can actually say, look, for this particular special case of MHF, there should be a way of actually addressing the problem more formally through that process. So it felt like it was just left to the health departments, and then we had to sort of push our way in. Maybe behind the scenes things are different, but it felt that way from an industry. So if in the future the regulators had a process where they could connect the MHFs through them and into the Department of Health decision making, that coordination of some sort, so we have a one-point stop from an MHF, that would be, I think, useful.
David?
Yeah, definitely echo. I think that for me is the key takeaway. If the support from the various regulators linking in with the Department of Health, such that I said that Saturday when I took that call, we did try using our WorkSafe inspector to try and find us a contact into DHHS, hoping that could be the case. And WorkSafe had really only within weeks prior been given probably a greater remit in this space. They didn't have they weren't connected at that point in time. That would have been a big help. Just more broadly, I think, as we've talked about, I know in our organisation that a global pandemic moving this quickly, I don't think none of us had this on our risk registers. We've gone back and looked at our enterprise risk register, like I think most organisations, and it wasn't there. And so I think we're all much more in tune to it now. And I think just because we have lived through it and we've bolstered those plans, and I don't think even when we come out the other side of this, pandemic drills will continue to be a core part of our resilience and contingency planning. It's not going to be the one that we'll get to next year. I think we all know that we will continue to practice this one because it's real, and it's important to maintain your resilience and abilities.
Yeah. So how did you go about staying on top of the routine and critical maintenance activities during the workplace interruptions you saw, David?
So probably, like I said, we divided. I think everyone can appreciate there's the paperwork side of maintenance, and then there's the doing side of maintenance. So we were able to, we did divide our maintenance crews into sort of like a 50-50 split. So the physical maintenance was occurring, and then the paperwork side, the planning side, that's what was done on the off days when people weren't coming to site. So monitoring our preventative maintenance program across the last 12 months, we haven't seen a dip in our maintenance programs and things getting behind. And I haven't seen a massive tsunami of test waivers coming through to request deferrals of critical maintenance. So I think it's just, again, as Rob's continued, we were deemed essential service. We did have essential workers, and you've got to stay true to that, and still have the people coming in to do that. And people understood what their role was more broadly in society, that we had to keep these assets running.
Rob?
Yeah, same. Essential workers, it's safety critical activities in particular, like the maintenance of safety critical, just had to keep going. Just had to slow down a little bit to make sure COVID safe methods were in place. People got familiar with that. But that was the simple part, I think, in terms of, figuring out the issue, is just then doing it. So that was fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we can agree that, sadly, globally, the pandemic is certainly far from over at this stage. And there are challenges with not only the suitability, the rollout of the vaccines, the availability of the vaccines, and what impact that's actually going to have throughout Australia and indeed the rest of the world. So just in the last couple of minutes, what do you think are some of the key challenges that we're going to face in the future as we continue to navigate this space? Rob?
Complacency and response fatigue. I don't want to put that aside. I think that's something we can all feel. When it feels safe, we tend to back away from considerations. So that's something we have to watch. For me, the resolving the impact of this close contact in a close space on the shift operations is a practical consideration I still would like to work through. And as far as I can tell, we're the only country that I can find that is using that close contact definition as an issue. And if you look at the Centre of Disease Control in the USA, they've actually got special cases where if you're an essential worker doing a high and it's a high risk activity of potential shutdown, they actually give the industry guidance on how to officially manage that event, so that the workers and the management can line up to how we continue to run. At the moment, I don't see that in the Australian context, so we don't have any legal framework or guidance that says, in the worst case scenario, you can do this. And I'd like to have that in my hands rather than a 2-hour discussion before the shift handover. So I think there's work to be done to systemize our pandemic responses and codify, so that we, the MHF, actually can run our show without having to wait for a call, as David had, that panic, particularly on shift handovers, when you've got the human issue of humans needing to know that it's okay to do something with certain controls and be authorized by the authorities that it's legitimate risk control, rather than the fear kicking. So that's my big 2 ones.
All right. Thanks, Rob. David?
I think those are 2 really, really, really valid points, and I think probably right at the top of my list as well. I think the other emerging issue that we're sort of grappling now with is probably organisational vaccination policy, and it's bigger than MHF's, but how do we approach vaccination? What are our requirements going to be? And then as borders open up again, and but I think it will tie back to some of Rob's points around, again, vaccination will take us, and immunisations will take us so far, but will there still be the same as vaccine rollout continues? Will the same rules around COVID in the workplace continue, or will it drift back and be less governed from a close contact standpoint? So I think that the 2 are quite coupled, and this is an interesting space for us to unpick moving forward as well. And I think even the ability to promote vaccines, the role an employer can play and the liability that it takes on is a very different framework to a number of other countries in the world as well. So it's a delicate one we're going to have to work our way through over the next 6 months.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for that discussion. I think everybody will agree there was a lot of really valuable information in there, and thank you both for being so open and sharing some of the challenges as well as some of the positives that came out of it. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and there is still a couple of questions that we didn't get to, so my apologies if I didn't get to your question. You can always go back and take a look at the recording if there's anything else you wanted to see or see repeated during this session. Thank you all for attending, and now I will hand back to Yvette. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Trish, Rob and David, for providing such an interesting discussion.